Please go ahead.
Thank you. So hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation, and thank you for the opportunity. So I'm going to present our study with the title Data Sharing and Reanalysis from Main Studies Assessed by the European Medicines Agency, which was a cross-sectional study on European public assessment reports. And I will talk about our study that was published as a registered report in BMC Medicine. So first of all, let me give you some background. As you already heard before, there have always been issues regarding the quality and the reanalysis of clinical trials. So according to Woodhead, over 80% of clinical trial data submitted to support new drug registrations in China have been revealed as fraudulent or substandard by the country's drug regulator. A study from Hopkins and colleague found that only around 15% of a sample of clinical trials were available for data sharing after publication, an important percentage that I will come later to again. Furthermore, issues with low reproducibility of preclinical cancer trials were shown, but at the same time, reanalysis seemed to happen seldomly. So in 2014, there was a paper published by Ibrahim and colleagues that they found 37 reanalysis of RCTs in the biomedical literature, but only 5 of them were performed by entirely independent authors. And it doesn't surprise me. And if we look, for example, at the conference here, we didn't see much reanalysis either. So, but aware of transparency problems regarding clinical trials, the European Medicines Agency introduced 2 policies in the last decade. So in 2010, the EMA announced to make every piece of documentation ever received accessible on demand. And so in 2014, another policy was presented to guarantee that clinical study reports will be available on their website from January 2015 onwards. A second step of this policy includes the submission and publication of individual patient data from the trial sponsor. However, a date for the implementation needs to be fixed yet due to Brexit. So let's have a look at the process of a marketing authorization. Very simplified, a marketing authorization means that a pharmaceutical company sends the documents of the drug trials for which they seek marketing authorization to the EMA, which then checks the evidence and approves or rejects the application. After a positive approval, a European Public Assessment Report, or short EPAR, is issued. And these reports contain several categories. And most importantly, there's one for clinical effectiveness. So this paragraph contains the results of the main trials, or also called here in the US pivotal trials, that are used to show that the drugs work. So our question was, how many of those main trials are reproduced when reanalyzed by independent researchers? So as a researcher from the US, you might say, that might come to a surprise to you, because why would this be interesting? Well, unlike the FDA, the EMA is not systematically reanalyzing clinical trial data for marketing authorization, and is not even in the possession of the latter. So if doubts exist, the EMA addresses them to the sponsors, who then have another look at the data. So the primary outcome of our study was to see if we were able to reanalyze the primary outcomes of the main studies. So as a starting point, 2 members of the team, my colleague Fabiola and myself, independently identified all European public assessment reports on new medicines, biosimilars, and orphan medicines given approval by the European Commission between 2017 and 2019. After that, we identified all eligible trials from the EMA website in a double-mannered extractions. So once all the trials were identified, my colleague Fabiola, that you can see here on the slide, prepared the study protocol, the anonymized individual patient data, and the changes from the protocol, and forwarded it to me, who then conducted a blind analyzing, meaning that I had access to the protocol, but not to the clinical study report, nor to the statistical analysis plan, nor to the final results. In order to minimize the bias, the protocol for every reanalysis was registered on the Open Science Framework beforehand. Once we finished I finished with the blind analysis, the results were sent to my colleagues, Fabiola and Florian, who unfortunately not here, who compared the new results to the original ones to see if they were the same. The comparison happened in terms of each study's conclusion, the p-value, and the effect size. So in some cases, and in most cases, there were no issues and the study was reproduced. But when issues were detected, the blinded researcher had another look at the data, but this time having the statistical analysis plan as a help. If correct this time, the study was marked as reproduced with verification. So what were our results? In total, we found 173 eligible EPARs, which contained around 300 studies. So after excluding 25, we randomized the remaining ones to get 62 studies to obtain our primary calculated sample size. For the 62 studies, IPD was demanded, but we only received it for 10 trials.
Wow.
So when looking closer at the reasons for non-sharing, we can see that the causes were diverse. Nonetheless, we detected some patterns. So for 13 out of 52 sponsors, the access was denied due to restrictions to the study status, for example, follow-up studies. 9 sponsors mentioned confidentiality issues. And for the same amount of numbers, the access was denied because of the doubt of scientific merit of an independent reanalysis. So having received so few data sets, we were wondering if this is normal. So in a postdoc analysis, which was not registered in our protocol, we checked whether studies belonged to a company that had a data sharing policy. So for the most part, 49 trials, the IPD set belonged to a company that had a data sharing policy. But for those 49 trials, only 9 IPD data sets were shared with us. Out of 13 data sets belonging to a company without an explicit data sharing policy on the respective website, only one sponsor was willing to share the IPD. So regarding the time, the median number of days before data was available was 253 days. All of the 10 studies stem from pharmaceutical sponsors. We identified 23 distinct primary and co-primary outcomes that were analyzed, and all of them were reproduced or reproduced with verification. So for the other 52 studies, we were not able to retrieve the data, so we ended up with 10 out of 62 trials, which is equal to 60.1%. There was no change from the original study protocol regarding the primary outcome of any of the 10 studies, and spin was observed in the reporting of one study. So what did we learn during that process? Data sharing rates are still low, especially when data is asked by independent researchers. And at the beginning, I was referring to a study from Hopkins and colleagues. So they found that 15% of clinical trial data from pharmaceuticals industry was accessible. We had around 16%, so similar percentage. Clearer and quicker actions are needed from the European regulation side. So since our study has been released, new measurements were announced. So from September this year on, the EMA will launch a 2-year pilot to reanalyze raw data from marketing authorization applicants in order to see if there is a benefit. However, the problem remains that when data was shared, there is no culture of reproducibility, and that reanalyzing existing clinical trial data is not seen as scientific merit. So the project that I presented to you today was part of a bigger project and has as an aim to assess reproducibility in therapeutic research. It's in a second project, which is still ongoing and also a registered report, but this time in the journal Royal Society Open Science. We wanted to see if we are able to reanalyze RCTs that are available on major data sharing platforms. So interestingly, in this case, we received around 90% of the demanded IPD sets compared to 16% in the study I presented. And so in another ongoing project, we are trying to see if the studies that were part of marketing authorizations, if the studies in this registered report in Royal Society of Open Science are part of marketing authorizations, since most of them were large phase 3 trials. So these results would then be useful to put our findings, or the findings that I presented to you today, into context. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you. The questions are starting. There you go.
Hi, Lessa Trump, current medical research and opinion. A fascinating report. Just a question to clarify. EMA does not analyze the data for submissions in other than what is provided by the sponsor?
So do you mean if they reanalyze it again?
They reanalyze it. The FDA does this all the time.
Yeah, no, the EMA doesn't have the capacities.
Yeah. So the FDA makes public the drug approval package after a relatively brief delay, often containing all sorts of other outcomes that are of interest to people like me and probably others in the room. The EMA does not do that.
No, because they, if they're not reanalyzing, they wouldn't have anything to show in that case. But I mean, good thing is, and this was announced, I think, 1 month ago or 2 weeks, that they're like doing this pilot because they were very aware of the problems.
Okay, looking forward to that.
Please go ahead.
Kelwon Hong from University of Maryland. Great job. I would like to really congratulate you for this amazing, massive work. 2 questions. It seems like you guys asked sponsors for the access to IPD. I was wondering, did you guys consider using like Yoda, Vivly, and other data repository? Because that would definitely increase the sample size. Second question, for trial documents like study protocols and the information on conduct of trials, which information source did you use? Did you use EMA repository like policy 0043 or any clarification would be nice. Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, we used Yoda and we used Vivly. Actually, we wrote directly to the sponsors. So most of the times they were referring to the data sets already on those platforms. And in some cases, they sent it directly to us. And some pharmaceutical companies, they even have their remote desktops where they can share data. And so unfortunately, you already sat down. What was your second question? It was about if we, thank you. It was about protocols, if we were using.
I was curious which source did you use to obtain those protocols, and was it coming from the Vivly or other?
Yeah. No, it was directly coming from the sponsor. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Mario Monique.
Hi, Max. Thank you for this. You went through the register report process and the peer review. Could you maybe reflect a little bit of that and what was the contribution of that to your research?
Yeah, thank you. So it was I think it was a good idea because we had a very tough review. He's in the room here as well. His name is Joseph Ross. But luckily he did some amazing improvements to our manuscript, which we didn't think of before starting. And he actually warned us already that we're not gonna get all of the data. We kind of ignored him and it came out with this, but still we were warned. And I think for this kind of study, it was a really good idea. My colleague, unfortunately, from the Royal Society of Open Science, it was a much harder way for her. They, I think it really depends on the field. BMC medicine, we're very welcoming. Psychologists tend to put a lot of focus on the methodology and even stricter. So it was almost rejected, but I would recommend it, but very, very early at the stage of a PhD project. Yeah.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Cameron Bassi, BMJ. Maximilian, thank you. Really interesting work. What's really demoralizing and sort of depressing is how many companies provided you with the data, and it's a consistent theme. And I guess in that context, a cynic, and we can be easily cynical, you would say that, of course, the ones who have nothing to hide will send you the data, and the real worry is the ones that don't share the data. So this has been shown again and again and again. The question is, what do we do about it? I mean, do you have any potential solutions other than putting Stuart from the Royal Society as the head of global data sharing, because you always get 100% of the data? Do you have any other kind of ideas how we change things at the EMA, FDA, and in the major regulatory bodies? Thank you.
Very great question. I think the change should come from within. So from, like I said, there's no really a culture of reproducibility. So that's the starting point. Other than that, maybe monetary punishments could be an idea, of course, but we see that with the FDA, it doesn't work either. Up for discussion.
Well, on this optimistic note, we'd like to thank you again.